Are you attracted to the labels that say pasture-raised when buying chicken, but also slightly suspicious? Many see these terms on labels and automatically make the assumption that they're buying a higher quality product. I've been there myself, so I understand. But I dug into this and I came up with a list of do's and don'ts to increase your confidence in buying pasture-raised chicken. Finding quality food can feel frustrating at times, and it's only made worse by misleading labels and terms, some of which lack real definition and are only on the package to trigger an emotional response. Marketers know that with catchy buzzwords and pretty labels tweaked just right with appeal characteristics, they can entice you to spend your dollars knowing that their products lack true transparency. That leads us to today's conversation. Now, being a seventh generation farmer, I know a few things about food production, and nothing frustrates me more than seeing consumers unknowingly buy products that don't meet their expectations. Well, I'm here to help and give you direction on how to buy the food that meets your expectations. So my goal for our time together today is to give you 5 do's and don'ts when buying pasture-raised chicken. Now, by the time we get to the end of the video, if you feel you are better informed about buying pasture-raised chicken, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button and become a part of a bigger movement helping others make better food choices. Now, without further ado, let's get into the information that you came here for today. And the way I'm going to do our video today is I'm going to go through the 5 do's first. So these are the things you want to do when buying pasture-raised chicken. And then I'm going to transition over into the 5 don'ts when buying pasture-raised chicken. So here we go, guys. Number 1, know the difference. This is what you do. You need to know the difference between the terms free range and pasture-raised. And I don't just mean know these at a very low level, trying to find a better way to say that, but you want to know these at really a high level, a technical level, and not that you need to be a technician in this conversation, but you need to understand what you're buying. And here's what it boils down to. When we look at these terms, the next question we should always ask is, well, who is the governing body that is allowing these terms to be assigned? So when it comes to the USDA, let me start with these guys, and you'll see why that's important in a minute. But when it comes to the USDA, they define free range in a very specific manner. I'll put that up on the screen here while we're talking so you can see exactly how they define that. But what they do not do is define pasture raised. So there is no formal definition for pasture raised. Now, I want to bring a second entity into this part of the conversation with the knowing the difference between the free range and pasture raised. And that's the organization known as Certified Humane. Well, as their name implies, they're an animal welfare organization. And they actually do define free range and pasture raised. In fact, their definition of free range is that birds have at least 2 square feet of area and that they're outdoors at least six hours per day. They go beyond that, and listen to the difference here in defining pasture raised, which they say is 108 square feet per bird, rotated, so the animals are not on the same area all the time, and they're outdoors year-round with either some type of mobile or fixed housing. So let me just go to the square yardage or square footage difference. 2 versus 108. So there's a drastic difference there. But here's the problem with this, and this is why you need to know the difference, because this is directly affecting when you look at the labels. So if you look at a label and it says pasture raised on it, but it does not have a certified humane stamp on it as well, then that terminology of pasture raised means nothing. And even more so, just seeing the certified humane, really in the United States, even though that is an accredited or a credible, as would be a better way of saying that, a credible organization, Keep in mind that in the United States, the USDA is the primary authority when it comes to food inspection and food safety and application of these terms on labels. And so, really, we still have a little bit of a problem here. So, my point to you on this is that you do need to know the difference between free range and pasture raised, just because those terms get thrown around so much. And a lot of times they don't really mean anything. Okay, so that's number one. So let's go into the do number two in our list. Remember, we've got 5 do's and 5 don'ts. So do number 2 is when you're getting started with pasture-raised chicken, start with an easy cut to prepare. Don't try to begin with cooking the most elaborate dish. And keep in mind, if you're coming from using conventional chicken as your model of pasture or as your model of poultry in your home of chicken, and you switch over to pasture raised birds, there is a difference. There's even a difference in the packaging. I'll use Harvest Hills Ranch as the example. When our birds are finished processing, they go immediately into the packaging, they're vacuum sealed, and they go into a freezer. It's just the plastic around them. That's it, the packaging. In contrast against what you typically see in a supermarket where it's sitting in a styrofoam dish, it's got some type of absorbent pad in the bottom of it, it's got this real thin layer of plastic across the top of it. It's a completely different type of packaging even. So my point is that there is a difference between conventional and between pasture raised, and that's not just at the packaging level, that's at the preparation. And that even just the birds sitting in these fluids for a long time, for long periods of time in these conventional packaging influences the way that bird cooks. When you look at a pasture-raised bird and it doesn't have that, you do have a potential to dry that bird out faster if you're not attentive to it, and you'll take what is otherwise a very juicy, succulent piece of meat and you'll dry it out, make it tough, and it won't be good. And inherently your thought process will be, oh, well, pasture-raised birds aren't good, when all it was that you didn't know how to prepare it. So give yourself some flexibility. Take some time here to learn how to prepare pasture-raised birds because it's not the same as conventional. One of the things that we very often get when it comes to Harvest Hills Ranch is people really like our chicken. They actually talk a lot to us and share a lot with us about how flavorful the chicken is. It's completely different than what they've got in the store. But I tell you this only to tell you that we had a customer that did say to us at one point, "Guy, your chicken's dry." I mean, they were just really blunt about it. "Your chicken's dry, it's hard, it wasn't good." And it's such a contrast to what the normal narrative is that it made me think that individual had overcooked the chicken. So make sure that you don't do that. Start with the chicken breast, one of the easiest cuts. My wife, Leah, actually showed me something the other day where one individual ordered 13 packages of chicken breast, and that was the whole order for them for this delivery cycle. So, it speaks volumes to just being able to cook a chicken breast correctly. You can do a lot of things, obviously, with a chicken breast and make it extremely flexible. And then thighs, if you're looking to try to branch out from just the traditional chicken breast all the time, look at thighs. That's probably the next easiest cut to prepare. You can grill them, you can bake them, you can put them in a slow cooker. There's all kind of things you can do with thighs, and they're extremely flavorful. But there are nuances to pasture-raised meat and preparation, and there are differences in chicken. And so hang with me when I get to the don'ts list. I'm going to talk about some of these differences in chicken. All right, so that's do number 2. Let's go to do number 3. And do number 3, and I want you to listen very specifically to this one, guys. I want you to look for a single source home delivery service. And when I say single source, I am defining that as coming from a single farm, right? And so that's important because that is in contrast to a lot of these delivery services that we now see out there in the marketplace. Things like Butcher's Block or Butcher's Box. Even there's a company out there known as US Wellness Meats. And I don't have anything against these companies outright. But what I do know is that they don't have transparency. There's nothing transparent about these entities. In fact, if you go to their websites, and I did this before shooting this video, you're not going to find any anything about where the meat is being sourced from, what farms it's coming from, what environment it's in. You're not going to find those details. Now, when you come from a single source, that's in direct contrast, because now you can directly ask those questions from that farm that you're buying from. What farms are providing the meat when you have these bigger entities like that? You just don't know the answers to these questions. And so if they don't say, it just leads you to think that there's no transparency associated with what they're offering. And again, that's in contrast. If you have a specific question from a single source, you can ask that question. So that's number 3. So let's go into number 4 now. And number 4 on the list when it comes to buying pasture-raised chicken is you need to buy local and support your local food economy. And so I'm going to get into this, and this is actually going to roll into number 5 here, but I want to take us back a few years when the pandemic hit. And individuals were going into stores and they were not able to find their mainstays, a lot of the commodities that they typically buy all the time. We looked at a lot of the big processing facilities in the United States, and because they're in confined scenarios, they were not able to process animals at the same rate that they normally do. And so we saw that there was a shortage in the food supply, and all of this can be prevented when you buy local, because you're decentralizing the food supply. And the other thing is that it keeps the prices under control. So you really want to buy local and protect your local food economy, because with multiple local food economies across the country versus one big centralized food economy, we don't take the hits when the next pandemic or whatever else happens that shakes up society. You don't have any bumps in the road like you do with a centralized system. Now, that immediately rolls us into number 5, and this one I cannot stress enough. And this is where you definitely have to be proactive. So do number 5, on the do list, what number 5 is when it comes to buying pasture-raised chicken is become an advocate for your farmer. Farmers are not marketers, guys. Very, very rarely do I see farmers out there trying to share content like this. There's some of us out there, and there's becoming more of us out there. But in general, it's not by nature what a lot of farmers do. And so you need to become the advocate to make sure that the supply of food that you're getting continues to be available for you. So the more business you can help bring to a farm, you can guarantee access to the products in those products in the future, and farmers can expand their offerings. Like, just an example on this, you buy the pasture-raised chicken, and the farmers producing enough birds now, and all of a sudden they can start doing ground chicken, and maybe you can add ground chicken to your menu. So that's just one example of how they can expand, but you can benefit from that expansion. I can't stress to you enough, don't have a scarcity attitude and keep the availability of good quality food to yourself. Don't you want the people around you to have access to that food as well? Share what value that farmer is bringing to you and help support them by sharing with others. So listen, those are the 5 do's, right? Those are things that you just have to think differently about how you're sourcing your food. You have to think differently about how you're preparing your food. And if you do that, you're going to have an absolutely wonderful experience when it comes to pasture-raised birds. But that's only half of our list. So after looking at the do list, are you seeing yourself now as a more informed consumer of pasture-raised chicken? Well, if you feel like you are, then I've got 5 don'ts for you that are going to bring you even to a higher level. So let's start off with number 1 on the don't do side when it comes to buying pasture-raised chicken. And number 1 is, and this is at the top of the list for a reason, do not expect budget prices for quality meat. All right. In other words, don't compare what your local farm is producing against what you see in retail stores. And I'm going to differentiate retail stores here into different categories. What we might think about is more of your budget retail stores, say like your Walmart, some of your grocery stores out there. don't compare. It's not the same product. It's not the same model of animal. There's nothing about these that are the same. So the other thing I want to note on this is that as I'm talking about not to expect budget prices for quality meat, that doesn't mean that shouldn't translate into your mind that the product should be expensive. That's not what I'm saying at all. So don't run with that. But understand that you're buying a product that is completely different. It's a completely different production model. Everything about the production model that you now have an interest in is inherently more expensive. Let me give you an example on this. There's a local small grocer chain here in the region that we're in Southeast Texas. They're pretty much limited to Southeast Texas. And I was walking through this store one day and I was just curious. I wanted to see what the cost of chicken was, different cuts of chicken. And I came to a pack of drumsticks. And those pack of drumsticks were somewhere in the neighborhood of around $1.40 a pound. Guys, at $1.40 a pound for an entire large pack of drumsticks, I can't even buy birds to start producing pasture-raised birds at that kind of price model. So that's why I'm sharing with you. You have to be realistic in your expectations. Feed is more expensive. Processing is more expensive. Transportation is more expensive. Delivery is more expensive, right? There's all these various components. You don't even get delivery with a retail, so just throw that one out the window. But you get what you pay for and you actually know where it's coming from. And this is an important point right here. Remember what you're buying. You are not just buying pasture-raised chicken. You're buying nutrition, quality nutrition, nutrition density. That's what you're seeking. So I told you I would differentiate the retailer. So that's more the lower end budget retailers. But ironically, when you start comparing against some of these larger chains out there that are more in the health food model, Whole Foods, Sprouts, and you start comparing the pricing that they have, their products are actually not any cheaper than what you're going to find from your local farm. And if you also look at the packaging that they have, where you see all these flashy terms on there, it's very common to see a lot of these terms, but also not have true definition and transparency behind the terms that show up on these labels. So don't get bamboozled and fooled by that or get caught up into that. And if you are, hang on, I've got something for you coming. So now, don't number 2 is don't trust labels that use flashy buzz terms that cannot be validated. So this takes us almost right back to where I originated our conversation at about knowing differences in the terms that you're seeing and what they actually mean. For example, so for this if you see pasture raised on a label, but you don't see the certified humane stamp on there as well, guys, it's not pasture raised. There's nothing there that validates pasture raised for you. And when you see the term free range, if you see free range without an official USDA stamp for that or without the certified humane stamp for that, guys, it's not free range. And I also want to differentiate when it comes to the USDA label, there's multiple USDA labels that can show up on a package. There's always going to be the USDA inspection label. That should not be confused with another USDA label, like many of you are probably familiar with seeing the USDA organic label. The USDA organic label is not the same as the USDA inspection label. They're two different things on the same package. So don't just, it has USDA on it. It has to be a specific stamp from the USDA. Okay, so that's don't number 2. Don't trust those labels with the flashy buzz terms and all that. Now, here's number 3. Don't be that person with shiny object syndrome. And you know who you are if you're hearing this and I'm speaking to you. You buy the label with the most terms on it so that you can brag about saying that you bought it with all these terms on it. And really, at the end of the day, there's nothing there that allows you to truly say and guarantee that all those terms on those labels are actually what they say they are for the most part. So if you cannot clearly articulate what a term is, and you can't say who the governing body, if you will, is that can actually allow that term to be applied on a label, then you're just buying a label. You've got to know more than that. Don't be that person that's just buying the label because you want to see all these terms on it. Actually know what those terms mean and if it's truly worth your dollars to invest in a product with all those labels on it. All right, number 4 is don't assume that pasture-raised equals a particular type of diet or feed being given to the animals. Now, I need to be very clear on this. When you see pasture-raised, many of you might inherently think, especially if you're not familiar with being around birds in a pasture-raised setting, you might inherently think that that animal is out there, they're grazing on insects and other like other insects that are out there. They're just grazing on that, grasshoppers, locusts, things of this nature, and that they're eating the grass and that they're getting a lot of nutrition out of that grass. No, guys, that is not how that works. They still have to be supplemented with feed. If you don't do that, their egg production drops if it's an egg producing bird, their meat quality drops if it's a meat producing bird, and you have a scrawny, unhealthy bird that does not flourish. That is not animal welfare. So what you want to think about is that pastured animal, even though they are on pasture and they are living in that 108 square feet or larger setting per bird, that animal still has to have feed given to it to meet all of its nutritional requirements. So don't automatically assume that pasture raised is equal to a particular type of diet that maybe we've conflated in our mind. It's not. So that takes you back to the local farmer. And again, this is where you should be buying from. And you want to talk with your local farmer and get a feel for what the birds that they're raising are being fed. And more importantly, what are they trying to accomplish with the feed formulation? What was the objective that they were trying to meet when they chose the feed that they're using? Or in our case here at Harvest Hills Ranch, when we custom formulated that feed to meet a specific objective for our animals. So those are all follow-up things that you want to ask. But the don't part of this is that don't just assume that pasture raised is equal to a particular type of diet that you see. This is why when I see a lot of terms on these labels like vegetarian fed, that means nothing. It means absolutely nothing. There's nothing that you can say or take away from that that gives you any insight into what nutrition that bird was being fed. Okay. Now there's number 5, right? I gave you 5 in each category. So we've made it all the way down to number 5 in the don't list, in that this is one that's going to translate back up to our earlier component to our conversation, which is don't expect all pasture birds to taste the same. And here's why. Not all farms are raising the same pastured birds. There are different breeds of birds. There are some breeds of birds that are known more as heritage breeds. There are non-heritage breeds. Here at Harvest Hills Ranch, we raise non-heritage breeds for our meat birds. And the reason that we do is because they make a better, more flavorful, palatable meat than does the typical heritage bird. The other thing that you're going to see is that differences in feeds are going to have an impact. Differences in seasons are going to have an impact. Typically, especially in a hot climate like Texas, where we're at, when you raise birds in the spring, in the fall, those birds are going to have greater weight gain than in the summer. Right now, it's August. It is hot. It is over 100 degrees outside today, raw temperature, not including the heat index. And we don't have birds on pasture very intentionally right now because those birds would struggle and they would not thrive. And it is not the optimal environment to raise them in. And if I continue to try to do that, then it's also going to translate into the quality of meat not being as optimal as I want it to be for our customers either. So back to the main point here on number 5 is don't expect all pastured birds to taste the same. There's going to be too many differences. So again, this is where you've got to ask the questions. Do I want a heritage bird? Do I want a non-heritage bird? What am I looking for? How am I cooking that? All those things come back in the conversation, right? Now, so at this point, I've given you those 5 do's. I've given you those 5 don'ts. So I truly hope that this gives you a different perspective when it comes to buying pasture-raised birds. And if I've shaken your paradigm and you're ready to learn more, here's a video on why nearly everyone telling you to buy eggs with orange-colored yolks is wrong. Oh, and by the way, if you live in Southeast Texas and you want quality food, jump on over to HarvestHillsRanch.com, where transparency and facts reign true.